I'm really excited to have you here, and I'm really grateful for you making the time to talk to this community. Um, Let me give a quick introduction about you, if I can. Your story is really a truly American story. Your family making its way from the ashes of the Holocaust and through a lot of grit and loss to an incredible place on the towering heights of basketball in the United States. When I read your book, the thing that really resonated with me is that you are the definition and so the culmination of somebody defying the odds. You come from Hungarian Jews, only about, I think, like a quarter of whom survived the Holocaust. And
Right.
then your father went on improbably to become a basketball star at Tennessee and then play in the NBA with Bernard King. Um, and then went on to become a general manager of the Knicks and the Bucks. And in your own right, you were a standout player at Stanford and you played professionally in Europe and in Israel. And you even spent a couple of months with the New York Knicks and you brought a gold medal home for the United States in the Maccabiah Games. And so it's really an incredible thing because I think when people say things like, "Oh, he's a Jewish accountant" or "he's a Jewish lawyer," everybody sort of instinctively nods their heads. But when somebody says that person is a Jewish professional basketball player, I think that's a kind of an unexpected thing. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about what that felt like for you to sort of have that identity as the son of a professional Jewish basketball player and being a professional Jewish basketball player.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's really all I knew. My birth was planned around the NBA basketball schedule, right? My dad was a player for the New York Knicks when I was born, and my I was delivered by C-section, and my parents planned my birth. So my dad could go on one road trip, be there for my birth, go on another road trip, be there for my birth. So quite literally, I was born around the game of basketball. And it's just something that I've always, really loved. And for my dad, basketball really saved him in many ways. Coming from Europe, parents were Holocaust survivors. Basketball became his way to fit in America, to assimilate, and he obviously had a tremendous amount of success with it. And so what kid kind of doesn't want to be like their dad? And certainly, as basketball was involved, that's pretty much all I wanted to do from the time I was a baby.
When I read your book, um, you describe a lot of battles that you fought on the basketball court. You describe your battle to come back from a catastrophic knee injury in college. But I think my favorite parts of the book were your battles against your overindulgence in your grandmother's cooking. Can you share a little bit with us about your relationship with your grandmother Anu?
Yeah, listen, despite the success that my dad had as a basketball player and as an executive, and despite some of the success that I had, my grandmother is the star of our family. She's the star of our story. And Sasha, you know that from reading the book, right? My dad will say, there's only one hero here, and it's not me, and it's not my son, it's my mom, right? Yeah, my grandmother is someone that so she's one of the most important people in my life. We talk on the phone every day. I wanted to play basketball at Stanford because she lives 25 minutes from campus. And so, as I write in the book, that was a long shot for a slow Jewish kid from the suburbs. But through a kind of a combination of luck, timing, some skill, I was able to go to Stanford to play basketball there. And my grandmother came to every single home game I played. And she's the greatest. She's not only my hero, she's also a hero. She saved people's lives during the war. She risked her life to obtain false documents for others. Yeah, and just by reading the book, that comes through very clearly that she's the star. And you mentioned her food. We're all biased, right? We all think our grandmother's cooking is the greatest. My grandmother's cooking really is the greatest. She's just this incredible cook, and she says that where my family is from, Transylvania, the women are known for being excellent cooks, and she is kind of like at the top of the heap, right? She just, she's a wizard in the kitchen, and it's not just food, right? It's a vessel of love and of history because they're the same. The dishes that she cooks for me and my family are the same dishes that her mom cooked for her family right before the war. And so, uh, yeah, she's one of a kind, and she's the greatest, and her food is as good as advertised.
You said that it was really important for you to attend school next to where your grandmother lived, and I think in the book you said and that she attended pretty much every single one of your
Mhm.
games. But then to contrast with that, when your father was finding his gift in basketball, your grandparents were too busy trying to make it in America and too busy working, and they didn't even know that your father had a talent for basketball, right?
Yeah, that's right. I tell a story in the book about how my grandparents got a call at their fabric store one day from my dad's high school coach, kind of saying like, "Hey, you should see this kid play basketball." And my grandparents were extra like so committed to my dad, such doting parents, but they were trying to build a life in the United States, and so they knew that he was just kind of playing this sport, but they didn't really think much of it. They didn't grow up in like the American system of professional sports or even college sports. It was just, they knew that my dad was playing a game that kind of kept him out of trouble a bit, but they had no idea what was happening. And once they finally saw my dad play, right, they realized that, oh, this might be kind of bigger than they thought it would, and then they were right.
When you had your grandmother in your corner and watching all of your games, how did that make you feel stepping on the court and knowing that she was there in the building and that she was watching you?
Amazing. It was great. Like I said, every home game. She was always there. It's great to have support, right? And that was just part of my routine, my ritual. I knew would be in the stands. I would say I knew after the game, first thing I do is we go in the locker room, coach would talk to us, but then I'd come right out to say hi to her. It was amazing. It was such a great experience for her, for us to be able to kind of go through that together, right? I had some lows, some highs, whatever it was, but she was always there. And who doesn't love having kind of a loved one supporting them and at their game? So it was great.
To build on that a little bit, as you said, you have your own kids that are sort of coming up, and in a few years they'll be ready to play competitive sports. And the most of the folks that are here are families or basketball players from Brandeis School. And so, what do you think as a parent now yourself and somebody who was on the court and felt that support? What do you think is important if you were speaking to parents directly, parents of kids who are involved in athletics? What do you think is important for parents to know about supporting their children through their athletic endeavors and supporting them from the sidelines?
Yeah. So I'd be remiss not to say hello to my friend Arian, who has joined us, who I know is a connecting thread for us, Sasha. So yeah, listen, I mean, as we all know, as parents, right, you can't force your kids to do anything. I think you want to support them, you want to nurture them, you want to be there for them and give them opportunities to find the things they like to do, you know, to succeed, to not succeed, to grow. I think it should be approached from kind of a place of support rather than pushing and trying to drive towards success, particularly at a young age. Because I know for me, my dad was an NBA player, and he never pressured me to play basketball or never pushed me to play basketball. And I think that just only made it a safer space for me, right? To explore it in the way that worked for me, right? You can't, you, yeah, you just have to let kids kind of come about it in the way that's appropriate and comfortable for them.
I was surprised when I read two autobiographies in addition to your book. One was Kareem's autobiography, Giant Steps, and then I also read Assisted by John Stockton.
Oh, nice.
And in both of those books, I was really surprised to find out that Kareem said that he, when he was in fifth and sixth grade, he felt that he was a liability to his team because he was sort of gangly and unwieldy, and the smaller guys could dribble around him, and he wasn't really, he didn't hadn't yet grown into the player that he would eventually become. And then John Stockton said in his autobiography that he didn't even start playing organized basketball until the age of 12,
Wow.
which both of those things shocked me because now I know in today's world it's all about starting early and organized sports and club and AAU. What are your thoughts about developing players and the right way to develop a basketball player?
Yeah, the right way to develop a basketball player. I think again that it has to be nothing can be forced that and it kind of has to be appropriate. And if if you force something on a kid, it'll never end up well. I think first and foremost, the kid has to be interested, love it, be really committed to doing it. But if that kind of like passion and that motivation is there, uh, then I think it's a wonderful opportunity to teach lessons around, the importance of hard work and diligence and rigor, and a regimented schedule. It's really, really hard to be really good at something, as we all know. So it's particularly something like basketball. So it takes a lot. It takes a lot. Um, and again, there, I wouldn't want to endeavor to kind of push a kid in that direction unless they were truly into it and they found it rewarding, right? But listen, I mean, there's so many different things that you need to focus on to just for basketball, right? To develop not only your skill work and your strength and conditioning and diet and the mental side of it. And there's kind of like an endless stream of things that you need to work on. Um, so yeah, there's a lot to be done, but it should only be done if the kid is into it.
When you were around the age that some of our young athletes are here, somewhere between 11 to 14 years old, and you had fallen in love with the game because you grew
Yep.
up with a game. Was there a moment at that time when you were, approaching being a teenager that you sort of said to yourself, I can do this. I think I've got what it takes.
It might not have been at that age, I might not have been that kind of conscious of that, but I always had kind of this innate belief that I had what it took to become something at the game, but I don't think it was a moment where I said, "Oh, wow, this might be a thing for me." Because of the way I grew up and because of the way I was born, it was just always a thing for me. Um, I think when I got into high school and I started playing against better competition and I would hold my own in certain environments. That's when I really started thinking, oh, okay, like I'm gonna be able to do this in college, right? Because I would just play against other people that I knew were college level players, and I was doing pretty well. So there were those moments, but it happened a bit later.
Uh, um, you are a second generation uh, person growing up in the United States after your family came over here. And your life, because of your dad's sort of meteoric rise, your life could not be more different than your grandparents when they first came here and tried to build a life for themselves. How do you stay connected to those roots and the place that your family came from?
Yeah, I think, my book has been a big part of that. I did a year and a half of research preparing to write the book where I, talked to my grandma, talked to my dad, really understood that history, and then of course wrote the book and continued to travel to speak about the book. And that's our story, right? Which is my family, you know, my grandparents certainly being from Transylvania, surviving the Holocaust, my dad being born under communism in Romania, fleeing under duress, coming to the United States. That's why when I talk to groups of students, I always encourage them to know your story, right? And ask the questions. Ask your parents, ask your grandparents about their backgrounds, because yeah, it's so important for us to just be aware of where we come from and what our histories are. And uh, so yeah, for me, I I always, it's always kind of front and center for me, what my family went through so I could have the opportunities that I do, right? I was born into great privilege. I grew up in an affluent suburb of northern New Jersey, uh, but I'm always well aware that my dad didn't grow up that way, and I'm not the only one on the call here who can say that same thing.
Yeah, yeah, I think anybody that's a Jewish person in the United States, or I mean, not even Jewish for that matter, at some point, our story goes back to immigrants that made the leap of faith, that made a sacrifice to come across the ocean somewhere, somehow, and try to make a life here. Absolutely. I want to share that I have a copy of your book here. Speaking of your book, it's called By the Grace of the Game. And you mentioned Arian, who connected us here for this conversation. He actually gifted me a copy of your book, which is really special. We met on the sidelines of our son's soccer team,
Uh-huh.
and I mentioned to him that I had read your book and discovered that you guys go way back. So that's it's really special, and thank you, Arian, for helping this happen and for being here. Um, you mentioned that your family history and all the sort of difficulties that your family had to endure. Um, there's a My family came over from the USSR as well. I was just a kid when we immigrated, and I remember from my parents, there was a real kind of I don't know, paranoia, kind of a guardedness about being Jewish. I didn't even find out I was Jewish until I came to the United States because my parents felt it would be a liability to tell me that I was Jewish in the Soviet Union. Like they didn't want me walking around with that. And so when I came here, they like threw me into Hebrew school. I started being part of Jewish youth groups, and so I just sort of took it very naturally that okay, I'm Jewish. This is fine. And I still felt my parents' guardedness about being Jewish and their sort of suspicion that anti-Semitism was just sort of lurking right around the corner. And I felt that they were overboard with that. Like I
Yeah.
never um, and then I went to college and I was at UC Berkeley right in the middle of the second intifada in the early 2000s. And that's when I sort of had the light bulb moment of like, wow, okay, like maybe my parents are onto something. So can you talk a little bit about your experiences with facing that in your life and how you dealt with it when it came up?
Yeah. Well, first of all, w- my grandmother has a cousin who also survived the Holocaust, who came to the United States, and she doesn't identify as Jewish anymore. So the paranoia that you mentioned, it's not just your family or that was not an uncommon response. I mean, there is a tremendous amount of anti-Semitism across, around the world. And so yeah, that's something that you do hear, right? About people kind of hiding their Jewishness in some way. That was never my experience. I always grew up proud Jewish person, went to Hebrew school, was bar mitzvahed, went to temple on the high holidays. My dad wore number 18 for the Knicks, right, which is a symbolic number in Judaism. So I think because of what my grandparents went through and because of how close I was with my and still am with my grandma, uh, Judaism and all that it entails was really just an important part of my life growing up, and it remains so to this day.
These boys that are, playing on Brandeis basketball and that are growing up to be young Jewish men and discovering their family histories, I think much in the same way that you did, preparing to go out into the broader world, preparing for high school. Um, what advice would you have for them in terms of um, sort of being aware of their roots, being prepared to deal with discrimination if it comes up?
Well, so I definitely, as I said earlier, know your story, right? I know it's not always the first thing to do, like to ask your grandparents questions about their backgrounds, but I do think that it's definitely worthwhile, right? So I think I would encourage all the students to know their histories and also be aware of the anti-Semitism that exists in the world, but know that you're not alone, right? You can't be Jewish anywhere in the world and not experience anti-Semitism. And so I think it's just important for us as Jewish people to be close as a community, to be proud of who we are, to stand up for ourselves, but also to stand up for others. My grandmother always said like we needed voices back then when all these really bad things were happening. We needed voices and there weren't enough of them. And we saw, tragically what happened as a result. So we need to be voices for others as well, right? Anytime that some people are being treated fairly or communities are being marginalized, that's never okay. So we need allies, but we also need to be allies. And so, yeah, I would just definitely encourage the students again to be proud of who you are, to know your history, to stand up for yourselves when necessary, but also to stand up for others.
One of the reasons that your book resonated with me so much, and when I started coaching the Brandeis junior varsity team, it was something that I assigned to them as reading. I said, I really want you guys to have a copy of this book and read it as we go through the season, because I think you teach a lot of lessons in there about how to be a good person and how to be an athlete. And you certainly experienced your share of adversity. You had this catastrophic knee injury, and you were really not in a good spot when that happened. Can you talk a little bit about that experience and how you found the will to persevere through that and come back from it?
Yeah, so I tore my ACL my junior year at Stanford, where I was, the second leading scorer in the conference, and I was on track to go to the NBA. So it was very bad timing. But listen, again, having I had dinner that evening with my grandmother, and looking across the table at her, knowing what she went through, right? My knee injury was a knee injury, but what she went through was life and death, right? So, I mourned my injury. It was painful in more ways than one, right? Emotionally and physically, but it's not, you can't control what happens to you in life, but you can control how you respond to it. And that was always, you know, my approach, which was to do the work, to not, no sulking, no quitting, no giving up, just mourning the injury because it was hard and it was unfortunate, but it was really after it happened, just it was time to get to work, and that's what I did. And I had a nice recovery and I had a long professional career. Uh, there are always going to be setbacks. There are always going to be bumps in the road. Again, that's unavoidable, and that's not really in your control. But what is in your control is how you respond to it, right? So I just tried to kind of approach my rehab, my recovery, uh, with that in mind, that this is in my control. I'm going to work as hard as I can. I'm going to stay positive. I'm going to stay hopeful, and that's what I did.
There's an incredible documentary, a 30 for ESPN 30 for 30 documentary called Bernie and Ernie, which is a film about your father and Bernard King and their relationship and their journey together, from playing ball at Tennessee through to the NBA. And there's an incredible parallel in that documentary because Bernard King has a catastrophic knee
Yes.
injury, and Bernard King fights and claws his way back to becoming a leading scorer in the NBA. And I thought that was just a really interesting echo of your story that would come later and the fact that your father had such a close relationship with Bernard King. So the reason I brought that up is because I was wondering if in that moment of crisis for you, if there were mentors or people around
Yeah.
you that you leaned on to help guide you through that.
Well, knowing what Bernard had been through, yeah, I did. Even when I got hurt, Bernard's injury was kind of in my head. And by the way, so I tore my ACL, which is a bad injury. Bernard tore every ligament in his knee and fractured his thigh bone. Like so when we say catastrophic, his injury was really catastrophic. And he actually has told me this subsequently. Bernard did when the book was about to come out. He said that there were a couple surgeons that he was talking to do his knee surgery. And Bernard King was leading the NBA in scoring. I think when he got hurt, he was averaging about 32.9, I think, points per game, right? And he said, I want to be an NBA All-Star again. Can you get me there? And one of the surgeons said, you'll be lucky to walk normally again. And then the other surgeon said, listen, it's going to take a lot, but if you're committed, I think I can get you there. And so he had his surgery. It took him 2 years. He missed 2 years and all he did was rehab, but he became an NBA All-Star again and averaged 28 points per game. And so that just kind of shows you, the power of the human will and what's possible. But certainly when I had my knee injury, I knew of Bernard's knee injury, and I just tore my ACL. I mean his whole leg basically just exploded. So yeah, it was like that example that kind of helped me get through my own stuff. Yep.
Who were some other mentors in your life that you really feel helped you navigate your career?
Well, definitely my dad, of course, right? He had been through it. He had played the game, and so I would always call him and just, anything I was going through, he had been through it. So I mean, I had such an advantage being able to always just pick up the phone and call him and chat about the things that I was going through. Um, so definitely my dad and my grandmother was always just an incredible source of support in a different way than my dad, right? My grandmother wouldn't be talking to me about the X's and O's and the mental approach, but she was always just a stabilizing force, right? So if I had a bad game or if things weren't going well, I would call her and she always had this amazing way to make me feel calm, right? And so yeah, I think that we all need support systems. We all need to have people, in our corner by our side, and they were that for me for sure.
For these kids as they continue on their path, whether it's athletics or whether it's anything else, how as a young person, how do you identify or how do you seek out the right mentors in your life?
Yeah, I think that, some of it has to happen organically, but putting yourself in position to be around great people, to say yes to experiences, and when you are around people that you respect, that you admire, that you want to have a closer relationship with, not to be afraid to build those bonds, right? And so I think that yeah, for the students on the call, yeah, it's about putting yourself in the position to meet the right people and then taking advantage of those opportunities once you do meet them and bringing people closer to you and not being afraid to kind of engage with these folks who you admire, who you think could help you.
Did you have a pregame routine before you stepped on the court?
You're a creature of habit as an athlete, so I definitely would have like my routines. I wouldn't say there was one thing in particular that I had to do before I stepped on the court, but I would have before the game, I would go out and I would have like you all my little tools that I would use for my muscles and all the stretching and all the shooting and uh Yeah, so I definitely there was a routine to it, but I wouldn't say there was one thing that I had to do before I played.
Uh, one of the difficult things about sports is that sometimes things don't go your way, and you can have a terrible game, or you can have a very difficult season where you don't win a lot of games or you don't win any games. Um, did you have experiences like that when you were playing sports, and how do you persevere through a stretch where you're just losing all the time?
Yeah. Yeah, of course. Things are there's one guarantee, and that's that things aren't going to go your way. Sometimes they will, and you have to appreciate those moments and you work for those moments. But there there's any athlete can tell you a lot of stories about things not going their way, and I'm no exception to that, right? At every level, whether it's the team's not winning, whether I it's me not playing well. Uh, so yeah, there were always times where things weren't going my way, but I think that it's important to know that is the case in sports. That's just how sports is. It's ups and downs. You're going to be on top of the world one day, and then you're going to be on the bottom the next day. I think the important thing is to stay even keeled, to stay steady, to realize you're never as great as you think you are. You're never as bad as you think you are. Uh, so it's just a matter of approaching it, with consistency and with positivity and just understanding that, hey, it's not always going to go my way, but I'm just going to keep fighting through it.
Um, you had a lot of discipline when it came to bringing yourself back from your injury. And I heard you say on another podcast, or I heard you talk about how you applied the discipline that you learned in sport to the discipline that you had when you were writing the book.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So writing the book, I remember saying to my wife, like, it's not going to happen casually. I'm not just gonna, just, oh, when I get a chance, I'll write it. I have to approach it the way I approach sports, which was, like you said, determined, disciplined, regimented. And so I really did that. I woke up early in the morning at the same time every single morning to write. I really just kind of approached it with tenacity. And that's what it takes as a basketball player, right? You have to work very hard, you have to be very committed. And so, yeah, nothing that is worth doing comes easy, and writing the book was no exception. And so I really had to kind of approach it with the same tenacity that I did as I approached my basketball career.
Was there a certain moment that you had an epiphany that you had to create this book? You had to make this memoir something tangible?
It was, I'm not sure it was an epiphany, but when I got done with my professional career, this is how I wanted to spend my time. I love to write, and this story was kind of like the story for me, and I knew it was a big story and an important story, and so there's nothing that I would have rather done with my time than write this, right? And so there was something kind of inside me that had to come out, and that's what it was. Sometimes people ask me, like, when did you decide to write the book? I didn't really decide to write the book. The book decided to come out of me, essentially, right? Like, yeah, so there was no really one moment. It was more of this urge to get it out.
I just want to display the cover again here, and I have two questions for you about this. So, first question is, how did the title of the book come about?
It's so hard to name a book because you have to do a lot with very few words, and so it took a long, long time. And it was my wife Sam who thought of "By the Grace of the Game," and as soon as I heard it, it just fit. And that word grace is really important for a few reasons to me. One, my grandmother is kind of the epitome of grace. She's just a very elegant, graceful person. Uh, and then grace, the idea of something being heaven sent, spiritual, right? I think basketballs place in my family's story is kind of has a spiritual component to it. So yeah, it took years. I remember I would be in the shower and just being like, what am I going to call this book? And I just come up with everything. And then, you know, it just had kind of happened.
Okay. And then the big question that I have about this cover is this is a very evocative and maybe even provocative image of a basketball with a yellow Star of David on it. How did that come about?
Yeah. So, for the cover, I wanted something simple, kind of elegant, like you said. Was it provocative? Maybe. Uh, yeah, for my publisher, they had different treatments of the cover. What would it look like? And when I saw that cover with it's just like is a clean white with the basketball, but with the star on it, because my grandmother had to wear a yellow star during the Holocaust, right? I think that was yeah, it just worked. And actually, if you could hold the book up one more
Of
time,
course.
I'll actually tell you. So the thing that really made this cover, because it wasn't there to start, but once they put it in, it made the whole cover is the shadow under the basketball. You can see that it provided this sense of kind of depth and yeah, so once that it's funny how like some little things can make go a long way, but the first kind of treatment didn't have that shadow, but once they put the shadow under there with the star on the basketball, it just worked.
When you see the yellow star, what do you feel?
Yeah, it's it's obviously, a symbolic because not only my grandmother, but so many Jews at that time were branded right with that star and they had to wear that star as, in order to identify themselves as Jews. And so, yeah, I mean, it, it yeah, it just speaks to kind of all the things that we've been through. Excuse me. Yeah, just having to wear a yellow star, around the city to identify yourself as a Jew and all the things that came with that, right? It's it's a very shameful part of world history that folks made, Jews wear yellow stars.
When I watched the documentary about your dad and Bernard King, and I saw some photos and videos of your dad playing, one thing that really stood out to me was this juxtaposition between the image of Jews that I think we were so familiar with from the Holocaust, this sort of image of um, pity and misery and then compared with those photos and videos of your father, you know, with his grace on the court and his muscles and his strength. And I really that really resonated with me. Just that those two contrasting images of a strong Jewish man sprinting up and down the court. That was really powerful for me. Um, Tell me a little bit about what your thoughts are um in terms of being a strong Jewish person out in the world.
Yeah, similar to what I was saying to the students on the call, just again being proud of who you are and yeah, and knowing your history, congregating as a community, yeah, all the things that make you like a proud Jew. Um, and yeah, like you said, for my dad, like he was this really big guy who was strong, who, succeeded on the basketball court, which is great, but he is more than that, just proud of his heritage and proud of where he comes from, right? And that's as important.
I have one more question for you, and then I'd love to open it up for some questions from everybody who's here. And that is that for the vast majority of these kids that are playing basketball at Brandeis and all kids playing basketball or any other sport, the chances that they're going to go on to become professional athletes in whatever sport they're in are pretty slim. So what do you suggest in terms of like what can you take away from your experience as a young athlete? What should you really focus on? Sort of knowing that the once in a lifetime, sort of one in a million chance of becoming a standout player in the NBA, like you or your dad, is pretty slim for most people. What should you really focus on as a young athlete?
Yeah, there are so many things that you learn from being an athlete that are transferable. I wouldn't think about playing in the NBA or, succeeding or any of that stuff. I would just really focus on the experience, right? Because through basketball, you learn how to communicate, you learn how to deal with failure, you learn how to work hard. There are so many things that the game teaches you, right? So, we say like use the game, don't let it use you. And yeah, I just for all the students, like I just continue to be aware of what an amazing gift the game is to be able to teach lessons and to be able to help you grow as a person. There are certainly, I have a day job now, and there's there are so many things that give me a little bit of an unfair advantage just because it's through basketball, right? The things that I went through, the commitment, just all the things that the game taught me. I use that with me now. I carry that with me now, and you don't have to play at a professional level or a collegiate level for that to happen. And so the game is an incredible teacher.
Thank you, Dan. So I'm gonna open. I'll mute myself and I'll open it up to anybody else that wants to jump in and ask you a question.
Sure.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So I've always been wondering, like, because I played sports, so I've had several games that have been like my best games, like Michael Jordan and his flu game, and I do you remember certain games that you've had that have been like that you're really proud of or that have been your best, and why have they been your best?
Yeah. First of all, thank you for asking the question. That's such a cool thing about sports is that we all have those games. You have them, I have them. Uh, yeah, I mean, when I was in high school, I had a game that I read about in my book that was a really important game for me, and I had 45 points, and that'll be a game that I'll always remember. In college, there were a few games that I played really well, one in particular against Arizona where it was on national television and we won and I played great and like those those stay with you forever. There are also games where I played quite poorly, right? And that's okay too because you don't have one without the other. But yeah, I there are games throughout my life that I think back on. Even when I was in sixth grade, I remember hitting a buzzer beater. Uh, and I can still see kind of my teammates running, hounding me after I made that shot. And so yeah, like you never are too old or too, accomplished in a game to remember some of those great moments.
Arian, you said you had a question you wanted to ask. I'm gonna put you on the spot.
Hi, Sasha. Thank you. Hey, Dan.
Hi,
That
Aaron.
game definitely wasn't against my team. I can tell you that.
No,
Uh,
those games were blowouts, so no buzzer beaters were allowed.
yeah, that's right. It's funny actually. So Dan and I grew up together, and we played basketball against each other. And Dan is 6'6" now, and I'm 5'9". But it was my assignment to guard Dan because at that time we were like much more similar in size, and we yeah, I had to lock him down. That I did at times. um, so Dan, first off, thank you so much as always for your book and um, for being willing to share with young people. I think one thing that I've been struck by over the many years of interacting with you and your family has been that well, let me back up. There's these two contradictory messages. One is it's just a game that we hear kind of in society. It's just a game. But then there's so much importance placed on the game. And in some ways that those two messages don't really align that well. You just touched on some of it. But one of the things that I kind of like experienced with you over the years was a very, very high um, priority and importance attached to sort of intellectual achievement, self growth, really holding your values very closely, and letting those be kind of the object and focus as opposed to the game itself. Um, and the game could have been substituted out for anything else, any other activity, any other pursuit. But in your case, it was basketball. Um, and I'm curious to know, and I think this was a large reason why Stanford was so attractive to you, because you had such a family value of getting a really good education and so on. And you can set the record straight if I'm wrong in any way. But I guess what I would love to hear you talk about with these kids is your experience of basketball as somebody who knew it so well from the inside that it almost it was just a game in so many ways, because really the salient or the most important parts of the game were not winning and losing, not even reaching the NBA necessarily, but it was things like the camaraderie of being a teammate, of learning how to just keep growing and growing and growing, getting better, whatever you do. So you touched on this, but I'm just curious to know, like in the locker room, for instance, like on teams, I know that there were plenty of frustrations in terms of not everybody being on the same page, uh, and I'm curious to know, like, what lessons learned are can you share with this group of contrasting your sort of experience with basketball with all the other stuff you've seen in the world.
Yeah. Thank you, Aaron, for that question.
Thanks, sir.
Yeah. So, you know, I think that there, like to your question about the locker room and how you interact with your teammates, and it goes back to the point I was making just about, yeah, not about learning to cooperate with people, learning to communicate. What's really cool about basketball is like some of your teammates you're gonna really like. Some of your teammates you're not gonna like that much. And that's okay. We all have people that we get along with that we don't get along with, but it's your obligation to cooperate, to win, to work together. And so I think that it's just, again, when you talk about the game as a teacher, I think it's an amazing gift that the game was able to teach me how to work with, cooperate with, communicate with people who I agreed with and who I didn't agree with, people who I liked, maybe I didn't like as much. And so I think that that's, when we talk about the locker room, right? That's a lesson that I still take with me um, from my days playing, just about, yeah, how you have to learn how to make it work with people despite your differences. And like, another interesting part of my family story is like language is a big theme, right? Because my dad came to America not speaking English. And one cool thing about basketball is the ball doesn't care what language you speak, what color your skin is, what religion you are. It just brings you together, right? And so I think, like you said, Aaron, it's, for me it was basketball, but that was just in my life. But it's really special when you find some sort of interest, some sort of shared interest that serves as a bridge, right? That builds bridges in between people of different belief systems and different skin colors and different religions and all those things. So, yeah, again, the game as a teacher is something that I always just very much believe in. And to the other part of your question, yeah, it was a kind of a value of my family to, the education piece. My grandmother loved going to school, but she wasn't able to get an education because of the Holocaust. And so, yeah, it did matter to me to get a good education, to work really hard in the classroom. And so while I was a basketball player, um, I was a student as well, right? And so I think that those things kind of went hand in hand.
And if I may, I'm going to just come back in with one more follow-up question. Because having read the book and knowing you so well, I'm going to ask just like an intentionally vague question, um, because I think this often, especially at a young age, gets sort of goes off on the wrong track. So Dan, I would love for it to hear your response to what does a successful basketball player look like? Because we're this group is basketball players, right? So we'll just use that kind of term. But what does a successful basketball player look like?
Successful basketball player. I think it depends on what an individual's goals and expectations are because it's going to look different for different people, so I'm not comfortable saying, oh, a successful basketball player is a basketball player who's averaging 20 points per game, right? Because not everyone's going to do that. Sometimes a successful basketball player will be someone who's having fun playing the game and making friends and giving their all. Like, that's a successful basketball player, right? So I think, and I'm very honest in the book about how much pressure I put on myself to be the best and to excel. And, it's not always about that. So I think that, yeah, it's hard to give kind of like a one size fits all answer around like what's a successful basketball player. But I think that if if a player is deriving meaning from the game and is showing up in a way that is kind of enriching to them as a person, then that's successful to me.
Uh,
Thanks,
can I
Dan.
ask one more question?
Yes.
So I have two things. One is a question and one thing that I want my dad to share. But
Nice.
I have right now in front of me, I have the Michael Jordan poster of the buzzer beater shot against the Jazz.
Nice.
And I always think, like, every time I see an athlete do something great, or I see someone do like some insane thing, I always think of like what they're thinking in their head at that exact time. So like if you when you're talking about the buzzer beater in sixth grade or like one of your best games, what do you think during that moment or what do you think after the game? What's on your
It's a good question. I think so. Usually, when those beautiful moments happen on the court, you're not thinking. And I think that that's what I had found in my career that when really great things happened, it was because my mind actually was out of the picture for a minute and I was just being very natural. My dad has this term, he'd say, when you're thinking, you're stinking, right? Like, because we know that as an athlete, right? You don't play a game in your mind, right? And so games when I played really well in that game that I mentioned when I was in high school where I had 45 points, my mind actually went blank and I wrote that in the book. Like I just kind of like, yeah, my mind just went blank for that moment. And I think that's why I was able to have that beautiful, amazing moment is because there was nothing holding me back. There were no thoughts that were intruding on anything. It was just me being natural. Um, and then after that, you think, wow, that's awesome. That's so your brain definitely does come back into the fold, and you just kind of like anyone and be like, wow, that's great, and you're excited and you're psyched and all those things. But definitely, as an athlete, I find that the best things happen when you're not thinking about anything.
Also, my dad shared a story with me about how like that I thought was similar to you and your grandma because you and your grandma have a great connection and like he told me a story about how when he was in high school, I think, he was doing a wrestling match and he was against a guy because you got separated by weight, I remember. And he told me that the guy was like, whatever, like 50 pounds heavier than him. And
Mhm.
it was going to be a really tough opponent. And his dad, my grandpa, was working a lot, so he couldn't really come to see him. But and this was a really hard wrestling match, and he was already thinking to himself like, "Oh man, this is gonna be really hard." And then when it started, at first he wasn't, everything was going like he thought. The guy was kind of dominating him, and then he saw his grandpa, my grandpa, his dad, walk in the door and sit down and start watching him, and because of that, he like felt courage and won the wrestling match. So, like, if you think that if you were playing a basketball game and you saw your grandma walk in, would that motivate you?
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that story. Um, Sasha, nice. You beat a guy 50 pounds heavier than
No, so I was gonna interject that it definitely wasn't 50 pounds heavier. It doesn't work that way in wrestling. What actually happened was I had to cut weight to wrestle at a lower weight class because one of our guys was injured. And so
Yeah,
by the time I
in about
got
an
it,
hour, but
I got into the
yeah,
into the uh into the wrestling match and I was really weak and malnourished. And so I just felt like there's no way I'm gonna be able to wrestle this guy. And then kind of what Dove said actually did happen, which is I looked up and I unexpectedly saw my dad in the stands, and I was filled with just this incredible desire to do well, and I was so inspired that he came to watch me, and it was such a surprise.
that's great. And yes, though, to your point, yeah, definitely seeing my grandmother, in the stands gave me that little hit of, purpose, adrenaline. Um, so yeah, yep.
I think it's a really important question, and maybe a good place to wrap things up, which
Mm.
is all of our students here, they're young and they're in their athletic experiences, and they're going to have many more opportunities, whatever sport they play, to have their parents there on the sidelines supporting them. And that was an important question for me, that I kind of touched on in the beginning, which is as a parent, there's a fine line between being on the sideline and showing up for your kid versus like being on the sideline and coaching your kid or berating your kid or showing
Right.
disappointment in your kid. And it seems uh, obvious, and it seems like common sense that yes, we should be proud of our kids and we should support them. But when you're in the moment, like this morning when we started, I was telling you about this futsal game that happened. In the moment when tensions are high and stress is up and everybody's it's all intense and everybody's loud you're in the experience. Sometimes it's hard to find that perspective or separation. So maybe we can bring it back to that. Like as a parent and as somebody who has two kids that are on the cusp of starting their own athletic endeavors, you have to kind of look inside yourself. Like how do you prepare yourself to be a better parent in supporting your kids through their athletic endeavors?
Yeah, yeah. Listen, I just think you show up, you show up kind of authentically, um, out of love and support. And I think that if a child has a parent who's present, and that goes such a long way to it. So listen, Sasha, I'm very grateful for this opportunity to talk to the students, and just thank you, and Arian, thank you. And yeah, I just want to again express my gratitude for allowing me to do this.
Thank you, Dan. And I put a link to your book in the chat. If you didn't follow my instructions at the beginning of the season and you didn't get a copy of the book, please do get it. I've listened to your book, I've read it, and I'm gonna reread it again now as Dove and I are gonna read it together.
Oh,
It's
that's
gonna be
awesome.
an amazing entry point for us to start talking about the Holocaust and all the other lessons that you teach. So thank
Well,
you for this gift,
all
Dan.
right. All right. Well, Sasha and Aaron and everyone, thank you. And I appreciate it. And we'll be in touch soon.
All right.
All
Bye,
right.
thanks, man.
everybody.
Thank you,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Thanks,
Bye bye.
Ashley.